Ladies and gentlemen, imagine a time when a human being was legally considered property stripped of every right and forced to live in chains. Now picture a moment in history where everything changes, a moment where the law itself declares that no man or woman should ever again be enslaved. In 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed abolishing slavery forever. But what happened next? Did freedom truly reign? Stay with me as we uncover the untold truth behind one of the most pivotal shifts in American history. This is not just a story of legal victory. It's a story of resilience, resistance, and the fight for true equality. And ladies and gentlemen, the year 1865 marked an unparalleled turning point in the history of the United States with the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, a definitive legal instrument for the abolition of slavery. Prior to this amendment, the institution of slavery had persisted for centuries, entrenched deeply in American society, particularly in the Southern states. Slaves, primarily of African descent, were legally considered property rather than persons denied fundamental human rights and subjected to inhumane treatment. However, the tides of change sparked by the abolitionist movement, the Civil War, and the moral and political imperatives of the time culminated in the legal emancipation of all enslaved individuals. The 13th Amendment, ratified on December 6, 1865, unequivocally declared that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to its jurisdiction. This bold declaration fundamentally altered the legal landscape, ensuring that no individual could be subjected to forced labor without due process under the law. The passage of the 13th Amendment was not merely a legislative victory, but the culmination of decades of struggle and resistance, symbolizing the triumph of human dignity and liberty over an oppressive system that had denied millions their basic humanity. Its significance extended beyond the immediate emancipation of African Americans, as it laid the groundwork for further civil rights advances shaping the legal and social contours of American democracy in ways that continue to resonate to this day. And this monumental victory was not an isolated event. It was the result of an unyielding commitment to justice by countless individuals, some famous like Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Tubman, but also the nameless courageous men and women who stood against the horrors of slavery. Their voices, their actions, their sacrifices, often at the cost of their lives, were the driving forces that pushed the nation toward this defining moment. The 13th Amendment, in its simplicity and power, did more than just abolish the legality of slavery. It symbolized a radical shift in the moral conscience of the nation, challenging the very foundations upon which American society had been built. The amendment erased the legal recognition of a system that had perpetuated inequality, subjugation, and racial discrimination. Yet, while the 13th Amendment legally ended slavery, the road to true freedom for former slaves was far from over. The struggle for full equality, the right to vote, and the recognition of their dignity and humanity would continue for generations. The law alone could not instantly change the hearts and minds of those who had been steeped in centuries of racial prejudice. It was not simply a matter of legal emancipation. It was the beginning of a long and arduous journey towards societal transformation. The passing of the 13th Amendment was in many ways just the first step in the ongoing struggle for justice. The country now had to face the uncomfortable truths of its past, reckon with the widespread systemic racism and commit to building a society that recognized the inherent worth of all individuals, regardless of their race or background. The legal changes initiated by the amendment set the stage for the Reconstruction era, where the federal government attempted to rebuild the southern states and extend civil rights to freed slaves, though these efforts were met with fierce resistance. The painful legacy of slavery would not be undone overnight, and the scars of racial inequality would remain embedded in the fabric of American society. But what the 13th Amendment did was give a legal and moral foundation to the belief that all people, regardless of their ancestry, deserved freedom and the right to live without fear of oppression. This was a powerful declaration that could not be erased. It was a message of hope, justice, and the unshakable idea that no individual should ever be denied their liberty simply because of the color of their skin. And though it would take decades, even centuries, to address the deep-seated social and economic disparities that continued to plague African Americans, the 13th Amendment had provided the legal framework to confront these issues. It was a reminder to every citizen, every leader, and every lawmaker that true justice and equality are not granted by the law alone, but through the commitment to uphold the fundamental principles of freedom and dignity for all people. The echoes of the 13th Amendment's passage resonate today, reminding us of the ongoing fight for civil rights equality and the dismantling of the systems that continue to divide and oppress. It serves as a clarion call for future generations to continue this work to ensure that the freedoms gained are never taken for granted, and that the ideals of liberty, justice, and equality are made real in every corner of the nation. And the enduring relevance of the 13th Amendment cannot be overstated. While it legally abolished the institution of slavery, its true impact extended far beyond the formal end of involuntary servitude. The amendment created a precedent for the ongoing struggle for civil rights and laid the foundation for subsequent legal battles that would shape the trajectory of American society. It provided the framework for the civil rights movement, which would emerge a century later as the United States grappled with the reality of segregation, disenfranchisement, and systemic inequality. The very notion that one's freedom could no longer be arbitrarily denied by state or individual power was revolutionary. Yet the question remained, would the nation honor this newfound freedom in practice? The 13th Amendment in its sweeping language called for the eradication of slavery, but its application required a vigilant and persistent legal effort to prevent the emergence of new forms of oppression. The history of American labor, especially in the post-Reconstruction South, shows us that while one system of subjugation may have been dismantled, another took its place in the form of sharecropping, convict leasing, and other exploitative practices that disproportionately affected African Americans. These new forms of oppression were crafted to evade the intent of the 13th Amendment, and they persisted under the guise of economic necessity and social control. The limitations of the amendment were made apparent by these post-emancipation practices, demonstrating that law alone, no matter how noble or well intended, cannot fully transform a society steeped in centuries of racial injustice. The gap between the law and the lived experiences of African Americans widened as segregation policies and discriminatory practices entrenched themselves in both the South and the North. Though legally free, African Americans faced immense obstacles in accessing education, employment, and political participation. These systemic barriers were not merely legal constructs, but manifestations of deeply ingrained societal attitudes that resisted change. The 13th Amendment's promise of freedom was not fully realized without the subsequent efforts of the federal government, social movements, and ordinary citizens who continued to demand equality. As the 20th century unfolded, the amendment's legacy was challenged by legislative and judicial actions from the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to the landmark Supreme Court rulings that dismantled segregation. These movements, however, were grounded in the same principles of justice and equality that had driven the abolition of slavery. The legal architecture of the 13th Amendment acted as a springboard for a broader recognition of civil rights, one that would continue to expand to include the right to vote, the right to education, and the right to live free from racial violence. Yet it is also clear that the amendment's application required constant vigilance. The struggle for freedom and equality cannot be considered complete until the structures that perpetuate inequality are fully dismantled. Every generation must renew the fight for justice, ensuring that the promises of liberty enshrined in the 13th Amendment are upheld. The amendment serves as a reminder of the country's capacity for transformation, but it also compels us to remain steadfast in the pursuit of true equality for all. The law may set the stage, but it is through societal will and action that the law's promises are fulfilled. In the face of continued challenges, the 13th Amendment stands as a testament to the enduring struggle for human dignity, the pursuit of justice, and the ultimate triumph of freedom over oppression. Passage of the 13th Amendment undeniably set in motion a profound transformation within the legal and moral fabric of the United States. However, the struggle to uphold its principles has not been without significant hurdles. While the abolition of slavery was a monumental achievement, the legal framework of the amendment was not a panacea for the complex entrenched system of racial inequality. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the nation faced the immense challenge of integrating formerly enslaved individuals into a society that had long denied them basic human rights and liberties. The effects of centuries of enslavement could not be wiped away simply by a stroke of the pen. Economic, social, and political systems that had thrived on the exploitation of African Americans needed to be thoroughly reevaluated. The 13th Amendment's text may have prohibited slavery, but the implementation of its principles required further legal action as well as a cultural shift that would take generations to achieve. The passing of this amendment was intended to open a new chapter, but the chapters that followed proved to be riddled with continued resistance. In particular, the subsequent rise of discriminatory policies such as black codes, which were state-level laws designed to restrict the freedoms of African Americans and control their labor, demonstrated that the amendment alone could not immediately end the racial hierarchy that had been institutionalized in the country. Although slavery had been abolished, these post-war policies functioned as a disguised form of servitude, keeping African Americans subjugated under different guises. The rise of these practices led to the enforcement of the amendment's clauses by federal authorities. It became evident that the abolition of slavery did not equate to the full recognition of African Americans as equal citizens. The 13th Amendment's enforcement faced significant challenges as local and state governments across the South and beyond sought to maintain control over the newly freed population. In many instances, laws that criminalized basic survival behaviors such as vagrancy were enacted specifically to arrest African Americans and force them into labor through convict leasing systems, a direct violation of the spirit of the 13th Amendment. This continued exploitation, disguised as legal retribution, mirrored the conditions that had existed under slavery. As a result, even as the legal recognition of freedom had been granted the lived reality for many African Americans remained one of extreme hardship and disenfranchisement. Yet despite the overwhelming obstacles, the 13th Amendment ignited a persistent fight for equality. Through organized movements, legal challenges, and social activism, a clearer path toward true liberty began to take shape. The fight to enforce the amendment in its truest sense without the loopholes of coerced labor or racial discrimination would persist well into the 20th century and beyond. It catalyzed the development of future civil rights movements, setting the stage for landmark victories such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These milestones served to further break down the systemic barriers that had been allowed to proliferate after the initial abolition of slavery. The battle, however, is ongoing. The legal landscape of the United States has continued to evolve, but the nation must be mindful of the forces that work to circumvent the progress established by the 13th Amendment. For while the amendment stands as a historic achievement, it also represents an enduring reminder that laws alone are insufficient to secure justice without constant vigilance and enforcement. The legacy of the 13th Amendment serves as a call to action, a reminder that freedom is not a static condition, but a continuous process that requires active participation from both the state and society